Senator Milne.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. I rise today to oppose the legislation before the Senate. And I do so saying that I think it is a tragedy in Australian public life that we have got to the point where the government and the coalition are trying to outdo each other on the level of cruelty and punishment they are prepared to inflict on refugees who are seeking asylum in our country. The fact of the matter is everybody talks about a problem. The problem will not be fixed. Well, what is the problem, Madam Acting Deputy President? What is the problem? The problem that is being cited is that people are losing their lives at sea on leaky boats, and we have to stop that. And I couldn't agree more, and I'll come to that in a moment. But actually, that is the fig leaf. The problem that the Houston panel refers to, that is spoken about in here by the government and the coalition, is deterrence. Both of the major parties in Australia want to deter asylum seekers, refugees from coming to live in our country. The whole message is we do not want you in our country. We want to deter you from coming, and we want to punish you so that you choose. We give the message out there clearly to the rest of you, we don't want you in our country and we will punish you if you try to come here. And what we're going to try to do is punish you by taking you to Nauru, by taking you to Manus Island, by taking you to Malaysia, by leaving you in indefinite detention, and that is the punishment, so the message goes out to you and your families that we don't want you here and don't even try to come, because if you do try to come, that's what we're going to do to you. Now, why? Why are we putting in place this notional view of deterrence when we're talking about people who are genuine refugees? Because no amount of punishment that we give people is going to be worse than the situation from which they have run, Madam Acting Deputy President. Women are running from Afghanistan because of the treatment that they are getting in that country. Recently, there was the killing, the murder of a woman in Afghanistan accused of adultery. She was murdered. A video went out around the world about it, and we had people from both the government and the coalition in Australia saying, this is terrible, this is terrible, this is why we need to be in Afghanistan. Yes, it is terrible. But what if that woman and her friends, what if people watching decided they had to leave Afghanistan because it could be them next? We are saying, yes, you should leave Afghanistan, that's a terrible situation, leave Afghanistan, but we don't want you here, go somewhere else. Land yourself up in a camp in Malaysia, land yourself up in a camp in Indonesia and stay there. And if you attempt to come here, we will send you into indefinite detention on Nauru or Manus Island or Malaysia or wherever else. We'll punish you. See, it's not enough you've been punished once, we have to punish you again. And what would those women, what is their crime that they have to be punished for? Their crime is that they've run away, they've been persecuted, they have run away, and we say, no, we don't want you here. We then go into this ridiculous language of advantage and disadvantage. Queue jumpers, that's an invention of the Howard government, queue jumpers, assuming there's some sort of orderly queue of people running away and from persecution. There isn't. They're in all kinds of situations in Malaysia and Indonesia. But this idea of advantage, what people fail to realise is Australia refuses to give visas to people from Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, because we already think they're too great a risk that they might want to come to our country, and they're so great a risk we won't give them a visa. And without a visa, they can't travel, they can't come through normal channels. If you're wealthy enough, let's face it, 13,750 people can come to Australia on humanitarian refugee status in Australia now. We take over 200,000 people, but not these ones. If you can get a visa, you can fly in and seek asylum when you get here, and you can get that from many other countries, but not from these countries because we deem them to be such a risk. So they get to these camps and they have no hope of getting resettlement. And they get to the point where they think their only thing to do, the only hope they've got, is to get on a boat and hope they can get to Australia, hope they can be assessed as refugees. Many of them are already assessed as refugees in Indonesia, already refugees. And we say, no, our priority is to deter you. And when the Greens stand up and say, if you are genuinely concerned about saving lives at sea, what you need to do is give people safe pathways to Australia. Once they're assessed as a refugee, we give them a safe pathway here so they don't have to get on a boat. What's wrong with that? And the answer is open borders. We couldn't possibly risk it. Nobody is talking about open borders. What we're talking about is lifting the humanitarian intake to recognise that when there are periods of war and persecution around the world, there is an increase in the number of people seeking asylum. And Australia, Australia, the land of the fair go, the generous country, takes less than 2%, Madam Acting Deputy President, less than 2% of the world's refugees. And yet we feel like we have to deter them because suddenly we are going to be overcome by this 2% of the world's refugees. And let me go to the issue of people dying at sea, and I will not have it that Senator Abetz stands there and says there's any vindication of his policies, because there is no vindication of his policies. There's no vindication of this general policy at all. And I want to go particularly to this claim that former Prime Minister Howard stopped the boats. What he did was excise territories so that when boats turned up, they weren't counted because they weren't turning up in Australia. That's why there's a change in the figures. It's how they counted them. But secondly, temporary protection visas. They brought in temporary protection visas because they said if we take away the rights of asylum seekers to apply to bring their family here, that'll deter them, that'll teach them, that'll punish them. Well, what it led to, Madam Acting Deputy President, is the wives and children getting on the boats because they had no other way of joining their husband, their brother, their father in Australia. They died on the CivX. 353 people died because of temporary protection visas, and that is forever, forever on the conscience of Prime Minister Howard, of Senator Sinodinos, of everyone else who worked in that office at that time and who exempted themselves from telling the truth, from even turning up to the Senate inquiries, and to this day we have not had a royal commission into what happened with the CivX. How is it that that many people drowned and disappeared? Who knew? Where were our coastal surveillance people? Why did we leave it? Which vessels turned up there and shone their searchlights onto people in the water and then sailed away? Labor had it as part of their policy in 2004 to have a royal commission into this, and it was dropped by Prime Minister Rudd. I want a royal commission into the CivX, and I would like that extended into the loss of the other boats that have come in the intervening years, because there is a terrible tension between the policy of saying we want to deter people, therefore we don't want to make it look as the coalition would have said, as if we're a search and rescue service. No, we want to leave people to the very last minute. And so the tension is deterrence on the one hand and Australia's obligations of saving lives at sea on the other. And the reason we have so many people suffering post-traumatic distress in the Navy and the rescue services is they know that people are in trouble, but they are not being sent immediately. People are in trouble because we have to balance deterrence with rescuing people. And the boat that went down recently with that terrible loss of life of 90 people, we knew they were in trouble on Tuesday afternoon. We knew they were in trouble on Tuesday afternoon, but we did not tell the Indonesians until Thursday afternoon that we were going into their search and rescue zone to rescue those people because they were already in the water by then and 90 of them drowned. And I want to know, Madam Acting Deputy President, I want to know who made the decision not to go on Tuesday afternoon. Who made the decision not to say to the Indonesians, we are going into the search and rescue zone, because Australians knew, we know that the Indonesians do not have the physical capacity with boats. The only boat they had can't go out in swells of more than 4 metres. We know they don't have the boats. We know they don't have the surveillance, the electronic surveillance to know where people are. We do. We know where those boats are. We know the Indonesians can't rescue them, and yet we didn't go. And I want to know why, Madam Acting Deputy President. So let's get this on the record. If you want to save lives at sea, it's possible. And one of the good things that has happened is that when I've been calling for codification of saving lives at sea, and the Prime Minister did move over the winter break to help the Indonesians get more capacity for rescue, and one of the excellent things that's come out of the Houston report is a recommendation that we codify our responsibilities under saving lives at sea so that everybody in the chain of command, from intelligence identifying where a boat is through to the people on the ground rescuing them, actually have a consistent set of instructions and know exactly what they're supposed to do. So let's have that on the record, and let's see when we start getting the calls for some decent and proper recommendation to the people who are doing everything in their power, Madam Acting Deputy President. And this is not a criticism of the people who are out there trying to do the rescues. They are trying to do the right thing. All of those people are trying to do the right thing, and their frustration is that they know in many cases they could have gone earlier and didn't. That is not their fault. Madam Acting Deputy President, I want to go to the actual policy here of what's being recommended, of sending people, as these vulnerable people, children. What this legislation does is says that the minister relinquishes his guardianship responsibilities, his or her, in this case it's a male minister, relinquishes their guardianship responsibilities. So children coming on these boats can be put into detention indefinitely. Indefinitely. Why do we think that's fair? Why do we think that's humane? Why do we want to punish children? Because we want to send a message to their families that we don't want them here? And what's more, we're now saying that we will not allow people who come, they're not temporary protection visas, but they might as well be. They want to change the Act so that the males who come can't seek family reunion. And that is exactly the logic that led to 353 people, mainly women and children, drowning before, and we're doing it again, even though we know that's the result. That what it will lead to is people knowing the only way they've got any chance of coming to Australia is to get on a boat, because they're not going to be allowed to apply through the special humanitarian opportunities and put in the back of the queue on the other in terms of the assessment of refugee status and family reunion status, and it will be years and years, decades before it happens, and that's why they have no choice. That is what's going on here. But one thing I think the Australian community hasn't realised is that there's all been this talk about we will protect their rights. Yes, we'll send them to Nauru. Yes, we'll send them to Manus Island. Yes, we'll send them to Malaysia, but don't worry, we'll protect their rights. Well, why are we actually having to debate this and legislate? Because the rights already exist in the legislation. 198A, those rights are there. The reason we are doing this is because the High Court said that we cannot guarantee people's human rights in these other places because they are not enshrined in law in Malaysia. They're not enshrined in law. So we can't guarantee to a person in a camp in Malaysia that they will be treated with decency, that they will have their human rights respected. And we know that people have been beaten, sexually assaulted, they can't work, can't send their children to school. That their rights are not enshrined, but that in our law we are required to do it, and that's why the High Court said that the Gillard government's attempt to put people in Malaysia was against the law, and the law actually codifies our obligations under the Human Rights Convention, under the Refugee Convention. And what this parliament is now doing is saying, well, we'll get around the High Court by removing from Australia's law human rights protections. And what this clearly says is there is nothing legally binding about what will happen in relation to this. There might be people of good intent and so on and so forth, but there is nothing legally binding. So people's rights cannot be protected under what is being proposed here. The other issue with it is this decision to excise the whole of Australia, the whole of Australian mainland from the Migration Act, so that everyone can be punished equally. Instead of the decent thing to have done would have been to repeal the excision of Christmas Island and the rest of the territory that was excised. We should have just gotten rid of the excision and had the whole of Australia actually operating under our migration law and our human rights obligations. You know, I feel ashamed, Madam Acting Deputy President, that our parliament is stripping out of the migration law human rights. We heard today of the Labor Party's proud tradition as being part of actually drafting the Global Human Rights Convention. And I thought how ironic that we have a new member of parliament for the Labor Party standing up saying how proud they are of being part of a tradition that drafted human rights on the very day that the Labor Party is moving to strip out of law human rights that people fought so hard to get a global treaty to implement, and that the coalition is standing up there beating its chest saying, aren't we marvellous, because we've now got Labor to agree with us and we're going to the bottom of a very rotten barrel. In terms of other things that this set of propositions does, and I guess this is really this issue of permanent, indefinite detention. You know, it's hard to believe in a country where we think we respect the rule of law that we could be saying to people, we are going to send you away and you are stuck there indefinitely, when we know that the last time this happened, people ended up with quite severe mental illness as a result of the experience. And Patrick Macquarie said recently that 6 to 12 months people have psychological disturbance from being in detention. And yet we are prepared to proactively do that to people. We're saying, you might be okay now, but we're going to lock you up and there's a high probability you're going to end up with a mental illness and psychiatric disturbance because of this, and we don't care. That's part of your punishment. And then what happened, of course, was when it was all found to be so appalling, the taxpayers of Australia have had to pay out compensation for the way people were treated in that Nauru detention centre. And we're doing it again. You know, if we don't learn the lessons of history, we are condemned to repeat them. And this Senate is now repeating the lesson of history, and that is that Australia's global reputation is now trashed, as it was under the Howard government years. And people around the world are going to be looking at us and saying, Australia wants to be on the United Nations Security Council. It wants to get on a global security council, and it has just shown that it has zero respect for the United Nations, for the treaties of the United Nations, particularly when it comes to human rights and refugees, which are central issues on issues pertaining to security and how you respond to security crises around the world. I would be surprised if there was any other civilised country in the world, and by that I mean countries that respect human rights, who would think it was appropriate to vote for Australia to go onto the Security Council. We have embarrassed ourselves. We have an opportunity in this century, first time ever, Australia has been well located in a global context to take a leadership role. We are an Asian nation. We have so much to offer in terms of leadership, of democracy, of human rights, of decency, of a fair go, of multiculturalism, all those things we have to offer. We had an opportunity to engage in the region in a leadership role, in a regional framework that respects human rights, that underpins the regional framework with human rights, and we could have then said, having increased our own intake, we will now ask other countries to assist us to take people, but we have not. The government ought to be ashamed. The Greens are standing here pleading with the Senate to think about our nation. What sort of country do we want to live in, and how can we have self-respect as Australians if when people ask us for help, we harden our hearts?
Thank you, Senator.